Hi everyone, I'm Luisa Fassi. I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge, where I work at the Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit and the Department of Psychiatry. I'm also a member of FORT, the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. And I'm here today to introduce you to Open Science. This presentation is supported by CERES and the Jacobs Foundation. So, a brief overview of today's presentation. I will start by introducing what is open science, and I will then move on to consider what are the values of open science and whether those values can be implemented in our current research and academic system. I will then move on to consider how we can make our current academic system better by using open science practices. And finally, I will discuss how open science can help you as a researcher to achieve the goals of science. So let's start with a general introduction on this topic. So what is open science? If you were to ask different people and researchers what they think open science is, you would probably get two different answers. And indeed, open science is often referred to as an umbrella term that really encapsulates many different things. Most commonly, when I myself teach open science to students, they refer to open science as things like open access, open data, open software, open code, and open design. So this refers to the fact of making the products of science open for others to see and also to use. Open science is definitely the products of open science, so all of these things, but not only. There are also other aspects of open science that are as important. Things like citizen science, so the fact that members of society and the community can take part to the process of doing research and science. Other things such as open educational resources, so the fact that institutions can make educational resources open for others to use and share, or a concept like social justice as well as responsible and collaborative research. So we're already getting at the fact that open science is not one single thing. One way I like to think about open science and the different components that create open science is to think of three different blocks. On the one hand, we have the products of open science. So what does open science lead to? And these products are things like open data, open materials, open code. And this is probably what most of you are familiar with. Aside from the products of open science, we also have the processes that leads to this product. And these processes are things like collaboration, reproducibility, and sharing. Finally, the last component are the values that underline the processes that then led us to the products of open science. And before I go on and discuss what those values are, I want to ask you a question, which is, what values do you think underline good research practices? So, UNESCO defines 4 values of open science and good research practices, and it is on those 4 values that I will base the next part of the presentation. Those values are quality and integrity, equity and fairness, collective benefit, and diversity and inclusiveness. You might have thought about some of these values yourself when I asked the question about what values do you think underline good research practices. And those are also the values that underline open science practices. So let us consider each of these values separately. But before that, I also want you to think, do you think that those values are reflected in our current research system? We have evidence to suggest that the answer to this question is that not always these values are reflected in our current research systems and can be implemented through research practices. So let's see whether and why this is the case. Let's talk first about quality and integrity. With this value, we refer to the fact that the products of research should be transparent. Transparent in the sense that other researchers, as well as members of the community and the public, should be able to see not only what your research results are, but also how did you, as a researcher, got to those results. And also, science should be reproducible. What this means is that if an effect is shown in a study, it should be possible to repeat that same study and then find that same finding and effect. So when we look at whether findings in research are transparent, are reproducible, and rigorous, what we find is that this is not always the case. Particularly when we consider findings in psychological research, what has been shown is that only 36% of results were reproducible. So when a study showed an effect and other people tried to replicate it and see whether this effect was actually still there, a lot of researchers didn't manage to replicate. This is not only the case in psychological science, but also in other disciplines. A survey was run where researchers were asked, have you failed to reproduce an experiment? And what is striking that most scientists experience failure to reproduce results, not only the results of other people, but also their own results. And this was true across different fields, ranges from chemistry, biology, physics, and engineering, and medicine. So we might ask, why is this the case, and why research findings really cannot be replicated and reproduced? Well, you might be familiar in the research context with statements or hearing from other researchers things such as, that's very odd that you did not get the results we expected. Have you tried dropping socioeconomic status as a control variable? This is also known as data massaging, where you're working on a certain data set, you have an idea about what you expect the findings to be, but because things don't really go as you expected, you might yourself or you might be suggested by other researchers to look again at the data and maybe change a couple of things and see whether your initial idea could actually now be supported. And of course, this can be extended many and many times, where you try different combination of things. Another quite common practice that can bring to a reproducibility of research findings is the use of selective reporting. So you might have heard from other researchers, or it might have happened to yourself as well, to say things like, we cannot report all of these analyses in the final paper or manuscript. Let's leave more space to report and discuss this very interesting significant effect. So maybe you have run a bunch of analyses, you have tried different things, but because the paper has to be short, compact, and tell a very clear story, you decide only to focus on an effect instead of reporting all of the different parts of the study. All of these practices can be detrimental to research reproducibility because we are lacking transparency about how you as a researcher got to certain results. And therefore, it becomes clear that when other researchers try to replicate what you did, if they only know a small portion of what was done to get to those results, they not actually might be able to find the same finding. Let's imagine that we have a set of clinical trials, so experiments in which we want to test the effect of antidepressants on a certain set of mental health outcomes. And this is the initial and complete cohort of trials. So each dot in this image represents a trial. The green one are the positive trials. They find that actually that antidepressant was successful, whereas the red ones are the negative trials. So we start with the initial and complete cohort of trials, but then due to study publication bias, what happens is that already at a first stage, only the biggest part of the studies that get published are the positive trials, whereas some of the negative trials don't make it into the publication systems. So we already have an overrepresentation of the positive trials. But we are not there yet, because it could also be that we have an outcome reporting bias. And what we mean by this is that usually out of all the sets of experiments that that specific trial run, there's going to be a tendency to report more the positive rather than the negative effects that were found in that study. So as you can see, the green dots are increasing. We might also have what is known as spin. So it could be that a result is not as clear-cut in terms of being positive or negative, and in that case the researcher spins a bit. It can be a mild spin or a stronger spin, the results, to make it seem like it wasn't that negative after all. So you might read that, oh, this effect was negative, but it wasn't a strong negative effect, or we found some evidence of a positive effect for this other outcome, so it could be that the results are mixed. And after spin, it could also be that we actually have citation bias. And here you can see how citation bias can really bias the literature that we end up with. So remember that each of these bubbles is a clinical trial, and here the sides represent the number of citations received. So what has been shown is that studies with a positive effect usually gets more cited than studies with a negative effect. So eventually, it is only the studies that found a positive effect that actually get cited, get known, get more media coverage, and therefore that create our ideas about whether antidepressants really work or not in this case. And of course, this could apply to any sort of effect in psychological science as well as in other disciplines. So let's now move on to the next value, the one of equity and fairness. What I mean with equity and fairness is that science should be fair, and fair also means that science should be open. Research can be open in many different ways. One way is that all researchers should be able to access the products of science. What this also means, though, is that members of the public and the community should be able to access the products of science as well, particularly those members of society and community that took part to the research, for instance, by being participants or by being actively involved in that specific research field. So, is research fair, open, and does it have equity? Well, again, this might not always be the case. Let's go over an example. It could be that we have a study that evaluates a mobile application for middle school students that are struggling with English vocabulary learning. So we have these studies that is published in a scientific journal, and then this study might be very relevant for parents as well as for teachers. It might also be relevant for the students that took part to the study that want to know whether that mobile application really worked. The teacher or the parents, the students or member of the public might go online and try to access the study, but this is not possible because of a paywall. So if they want to read the study, they need to purchase it, and usually there's quite a high price for each study, ranging from $10, $20, $30. But if they want to actually go on and read other studies related to this topic, they would need to subscribe to the journal, and this can be more than $200 or $300. So this issue has been recognized in research, and things have been written about it. So here you can see an article about the growing inaccessibility of science. But ironically enough, this article was also covered by a paywall, so it was not possible for people outside of the scientific field to actually access it and read it. The next value that UNESCO defines is the one of collective benefit. What collective benefit means is that the products of research should benefit society and the community as a whole. So they should be done in the interest of the people on which the research is done and for which the research is done. This sounds quite straightforward, but there are cases in which it might not be the case. So let's imagine an example in which we have a company that wants to test the effects of a certain video game on children's mental health. The company wants to test the effect of this video game, so they decide to pay a group of researchers to actually test these different effects. And then the researchers have to report back to the company. Here we might ask, well, who does the researchers have interest on? So what interest do they have in mind? Is it the public? Is it the community? Is it the company that is sponsoring them? But also, what happens if the researcher finds that actually the video game might be detrimental for children's mental health? what are they gonna report to the company, and are they gonna be able to actually publish these results? So conflict of interest can appear in many different ways, and it's very important to keep in mind what are the different conflict of interest that arise whenever a researcher is running a study. The last value that UNESCO defines is the one of diversity and inclusiveness. Diversity and inclusiveness refers to the fact that research should be diverse and non-discriminatory in many ways. First of all, in terms of the researchers that run studies. So researchers should be diverse. Everybody should be able to take part to the scientific process, no matter their gender, ethnicity, and religion. What this also means, though, is that researchers should be diverse in terms of the samples that studies examines. So samples should reflect global populations, and it is on this last aspect that I will focus the next slide. So when we mean that samples should be diverse, we are referring to the fact that we want research to reflect global populations. And this is not always the case, particularly in psychological research. For example, we know that only 7% of research samples published in Psychological Science, which is quite a renowned journal in the field of psychology, examine population from non-Western countries, despite we know that these countries represent the majority of the world population. So it is very striking that only 7% of studies examine population, for instance, from the Global South. And I can also speak from my own experience here, as I've recently run a review, a meta-analysis, looking at social media use and mental health. And what we were interested in is what is the amount of studies that examine Global South populations compared to Global North when looking at the effect of social media use on mental health. So here you can see a world map with highlighted in a darker blue are the areas that are more populated in the world. And as expected, of course, most of the world population lives in the Global South. However, when we examine what are the amount of articles and scientific articles that are published on this topic, what we found was a bias towards the Global North. So despite most of people live in the Global South, actually most studies looked at a Global North population to infer about this specific topic. So why is our current scientific system not fit for purpose? Why is it not yet possible, at least not always, to implement these open science practices, to implement values such as equity, fairness, and openness? To answer this question, we need to think what are the things that we value in research. And these things are things such as novelty, the quantity of publication oftentimes over the quality of these publications, whether publications are done in high-impact journals like Nature, and also things like the H-index. So how much citations does a certain publication get, and what is the number of publications? So these are the things that we value in research, and this creates a clear conflict between what we value and, on the other hand, what most people think are the values that should underline good research practices. Things such as open access, inclusivity, and transparency. This conflict often results in researchers feeling very stressed and oftentimes also confused and conflicted about what to do. They would like to implement those values, but also those values oftentimes required time. And we live in an academic system where time is very precious, and there's a whole incentive system that actually bring researchers to publish fast and publish something novel instead of step back and really implement transparency and integrity throughout the research process. So how can we do things better? There's many ways in which open science can help us to make things better, and here you can see the different clusters that are identified by Forts about open science practices. One way to make things better is to increase knowledge about reproducibility and replicability. And by increasing knowledge, I mean educating researchers as well as students about what reproducibility and replicability mean. Another important step is not only to teach people what reproducibility is, but also how can reproducibility be implemented. So how can we do reproducible analysis and replication research? And we will expand on each of these aspects in the next lectures. Another aspect is pre-registration, in which you as a researcher define beforehand what are your hypotheses about a certain experiment and what you expect to find, as well as how you want to analyze the data. Another aspect is the increasing conceptual and statistical knowledge. So what are, for instance, the differences between null hypothesis testing and Bayesian statistics, and how those differences can actually change the way we see and interpret research results. Another cluster is the use of fair data and materials. So data that is interpretable, that is reproducible, and also that is accessible. The last cluster is the one of our academic life, ethics and culture, in which we think about how our current academic system can actually support the use of open science practices, and how we as researchers can change it bottom up to really allow these values to be implemented. I want to end this presentation discussing what's in for you. So how open science can help you as a researcher. One important aspect of open science is that it can increase trust in your research. Because members of the public, but particularly other researchers, can actually see not only what your results are, but how you got to those results, there's gonna be more trust that comes from more scrutiny of your research. Another important aspect is that open science can help you gain visibility, for instance, through data sharing. And related to this is also the fact that by sharing data, you might find new projects, new collaborators, and we know that cross-fertilization of ideas is a really important aspect of research, whereby by sharing a project, you might actually find new ideas and find collaborators that complement your skill set. Another important aspect is the fact that publishing openly is actually associated with higher citation rates. And we also know that open publications get more media coverage. So by publishing openly, you as a researcher can again gain visibility. Lastly, talking from my own experience, I think open science can make you feel better. It can help you to feel less confused about what you should report maybe, or like what findings should you value more. By being transparent throughout the research project, you can also get more feedback from other researchers about things that can be done better. So this is the end of the presentation. I would like to thank CERES and the Jacobs Foundation for this opportunity. And here you can find my contact details. May you have any question. Thank you.